The photograph fell from Daniel's jacket pocket like a confession dropping from guilty lips. October 15th, 1955, and I was collecting his laundry when the sepia-toned image fluttered to our kitchen floor. A young woman with Daniel's exact eyes and stubborn chin, her hand resting on a pregnant belly. On the back, in faded ink, Margaret Sullivan, Chicago, 1913. My blood turned to ice water. After 42 years of motherhood, I was staring at proof that everything had been a lie. "Daniel," I called, my voice catching like a rusty hinge. "Whose photograph is this?" He appeared in the doorway, fresh from his morning shift at the grain elevator, and froze when he saw what I held. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other across a chasm that had just torn open between us. Then, his face twisted into something I'd never seen before. Not anger, but triumph. "So you finally know," he said, his voice soft as a blade sliding between ribs. "Took you long enough to figure it out, Mother." The way he said that word, like it was poison on his tongue, made my knees buckle. I gripped the kitchen counter, fighting to stay upright as 42 years of memories crumbled around me. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Who is she?" "My real mother," Daniel said, stepping closer with the predatory grace of a cat cornering a mouse. "The one who should have raised me. The one you replaced with your lies." My mind reeled backward to 1913, to George returning from that business trip to Chicago with a 6-month-old baby and tears in his eyes. "Her name was Margaret," he'd said. "She died in childbirth. The boy has no one else." We'd agreed to raise Daniel as our own, to never speak of his origins. I thought we were saving him from the pain of being unwanted. Now, standing in my kitchen with autumn rain drumming against the windows, I realized we'd created something far worse. "How long have you known?" I asked. 6 months," he said, circling me like I was prey. "Hired a detective, found the records, learned the truth about what you and Dad stole from me. All those years, I could have been somebody in Chicago. Instead, I'm stuck in this godforsaken town with a woman who's not even my real mother." The hatred in his voice was like a physical blow. This was my son, the boy I'd nursed through scarlet fever, taught to read, held when nightmares woke him screaming. The man I'd defended when his marriage failed, welcomed home when he had nowhere else to go. "Daniel, I loved you." "Love." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You don't love someone by building their entire life on lies. You love them by telling them the truth, even when it hurts." Rain lashed the windows harder now, and I could hear the Mississippi rising in the distance, the same river that had shaped my childhood, that threatened to flood our farmhouse every few years. But the real danger wasn't coming from outside. "What do you want?" I asked. His smile was cold as January. "What's rightfully mine? This house, the bank accounts, everything Dad left us both. And maybe—" His eyes traveled over my body in a way that made my skin crawl. "Maybe it's time you learned what happens to women who think they can control men with their lies." Before I could process what he meant by that, he was moving toward me with predatory intent. I backed against the sink, trapped, as the boy I'd raised became a stranger I no longer recognized. "Don't," I said, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "You owe me," he growled, his breath hot against my face. "For 42 years of lies, for stealing my real life, for making me live in this prison you call love." What happened next would shatter every illusion I'd ever held about family love and the sacred bond between mother and child. But it would also reveal a strength I never knew I possessed, a determination to seek justice even when the whole world seemed determined to silence me. The photograph of Margaret Sullivan lay forgotten on the floor as my carefully constructed world began its violent collapse. Outside, the Mississippi kept rising, and inside, a different kind of flood was about to wash away everything I thought I knew about the boy I'd raised as my own son. The assault happened in my own bathroom in the house where I'd spent 35 years feeling safe. Daniel forced me against the cold tile wall, his hands rough and unyielding, while he whispered things that will haunt me until I die. "This is what you deserve," he snarled as I fought uselessly against his strength. 42 years of lies, and now you pay the price. I won't describe the violence in detail. Some memories are too sacred to profane with specifics. But when it was over, when he'd walked away like nothing had happened, I lay on the shower floor, understanding that everything had changed. The boy I'd raised was gone. In his place was a predator who saw me not as his mother, but as the architect of his stolen life. I should have called Sheriff Williams immediately. Any reasonable person would have. But shame is a powerful silencer, and in 1955, the idea of a son raping his mother was so unthinkable that even I struggled to name what had happened. Instead, I did what women of my generation had been taught to do. I cleaned the house, made coffee, and pretended normalcy while my soul bled. Daniel sat at breakfast methodically cutting his eggs, while the radio droned about rising river levels. The casual domesticity felt like mockery, the dutiful son sharing morning coffee with his mother. "Weather's getting worse," he said without looking up. "River might top the levees." I poured coffee with shaking hands, every movement agony. "We should think about sandbagging." He looked up, then studying my face with the cold assessment of someone evaluating damage. "Don't worry about the river, Mom. I'll take care of everything. That's what good sons do, protect their mothers." The emphasis on mothers made me flinch. He was reminding me that our entire relationship was built on deception, that my maternal authority was fraudulent. "Daniel," I began carefully, "about this morning." "Well, what about it?" His voice carried a warning. "Did something happen this morning?" The threat was clear: deny it happened or face consequences. I nodded mutely, hating my own cowardice, but not yet ready for open war. He smiled, satisfied. "Good. Because if you ever get confused about what happened, I'd hate for people to think you were unstable. Elderly women sometimes imagine things, especially after traumatic events, like discovering family secrets." With that, he left for work, leaving me alone with my terror and the growing certainty that this was only the beginning. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 days later when Martha Ellis stopped by for our weekly coffee visit. Martha was my oldest friend, a sharp-eyed widow who'd known me since we were girls. She took one look at my bruised wrists and haunted expression and set down her cup with deliberate precision. "Evelyn Harper, what in the hell happened to you?" I'd practiced lying, planned to blame my injuries on a fall. But when Martha fixed me with those knowing eyes, 30 years of friendship crumbled my defenses. "And Daniel," I whispered the word barely audible. He hurt me." Martha's face went white. "Hurt you? How?" The whole story poured out: the photograph, the revelation about his parentage, the assault that followed. Martha listened in growing horror, her hands clenched so tight, her knuckles went white. "Jesus Christ, Evelyn, you have to report this." "Just us to who, Tom Williams?" I shook my head. He'd never believe a mother would accuse her own son of rape. People would think I've lost my mind. Then we'll make them believe," Martha said fiercely. "This isn't the 19th century. Women have rights now, even against their own families." But even as she spoke, we both knew the reality. In small-town Iowa, family scandals were buried, not prosecuted. The social pressure to keep quiet would be overwhelming. "There's something else," I said, and told her about Daniel's comments, his threats about making me seem unstable. "He's been planning this, Martha. The assault wasn't random violence, it was calculated revenge." Martha stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see Daniel's truck in the yard. "How long has he known about the adoption?" 6 months, according to him. He hired a detective. And he's been living here planning this, waiting for the right moment to... She trailed off, too angry to finish. I don't know what to do, I admitted. If I report it, he'll destroy me. If I don't, he might do worse. Martha turned back to me, her expression resolute. Evelyn, I've known you for 60 years. You delivered my babies, held my hand when my husband died, never backed down from a fight when it mattered. You think I'm going to let some twisted boy adopt it or not destroy the strongest woman I've ever known? Her faith in me was humbling, but I felt anything but strong. I'm scared, Martha. Good, she said. Scared means you're still thinking clearly, but scared doesn't mean defeated. We spent the next hour planning. Martha would help me document everything: the injuries, Daniel's threats, any evidence of his investigation into his origins. We'd build a case so solid that even the skeptics would have to listen. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. That evening, after Daniel left for his second shift, I searched his room like the desperate woman I'd become. Under his mattress, I found a manila folder containing everything he'd learned about his true parentage. The private detective's report was thorough. Margaret Sullivan, 19, died in childbirth at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago on March 15, 1913. Father listed as George Harper, married of Willow Creek, Iowa. The baby was released to Mr. Harper 3 days later, with adoption papers filed in Cook County. There were photographs of Margaret, beautiful, young, full of life. In one, she was laughing at something beyond the camera's range, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. This was the woman Daniel believed should have raised him, who would have given him a real life in the city, instead of what he saw as rural imprisonment. But the most chilling discovery was a letter Daniel had written but never sent, addressed to me. Dear Mother, by the time you read this, you'll understand what it feels like to have your life destroyed by someone else's lies. You stole 42 years from me, made me live as someone I'm not in a place I hate. You think love justifies deception, but you're wrong. Love demands truth, and since you never gave me that, I'll take what I'm owed in other ways. You created this monster with your lies. Now you get to live with the consequences. The letter was dated 6 months earlier, confirming that Daniel had been planning his revenge since discovering the truth. The assault wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated punishment designed to destroy me as thoroughly as he believed I'd destroyed him. But there was something else in the folder that made my blood run cold: photographs of our house, taken from different angles, with notes about my daily routines. Pictures of me hanging laundry, working in the garden, walking to the mailbox. He'd been watching me, studying me, preparing for something far beyond a single assault. I was reading his surveillance notes when I heard his truck in the driveway. Quickly, I returned everything to its hiding place and retreated to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Daniel's voice drifted up from the kitchen. Mom, you up there? Just getting ready for bed. I called back, proud that my voice sounded steady. Good. Sleep well. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. I lay awake all night listening to him move around downstairs, wondering what he meant by busy. By morning, I'd made my decision. Whatever the consequences, I couldn't live in terror anymore. It was time to fight back. The question was whether I was strong enough to survive the war I was about to start. Sheriff Tom Williams looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than sitting across from me in his cramped office above Murphy's Hardware. A decent man trapped in an indecent situation, he kept fidgeting with his coffee cup while I recounted the assault in clinical detail. Mrs. Harper, he said when I finished, these are serious accusations. You're talking about your own son. I'm talking about rape, I corrected. The family relationship doesn't change what happened. Williams winced at my directness. In 1955, people didn't discuss such things openly, especially not elderly women accusing their own children. I have to ask, are you certain you didn't misinterpret what happened? Sometimes grief and stress can make us see things that aren't quite. Sheriff Talfe. I interrupted. I've been a nurse for 40 years. I know the difference between imagination and assault. I have bruises, torn clothing, and injuries that a doctor can document. This isn't confusion, it's crime. He studied me for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications. If I investigate this, it'll become public knowledge. The whole town will know. Are you prepared for that? The question hit me like a physical blow. Was I prepared to become the woman who sent her own son to prison? To be whispered about in grocery stores and church pews? To lose whatever respectability I'd built over 7 decades of life? Sheriff, what's the alternative? I go home and pretend it didn't happen? Wait for him to do it again, or worse? Worse, I told him about the surveillance photos, the threatening letter, Daniel's careful planning. Williams's expression grew increasingly grave as he realized this wasn't a family dispute that could be smoothed over with mediation. I'll bring him in for questioning, he said finally. But I want you to understand cases like this are hard to prove. It'll be your word against his and jury's. Well, they don't like to see families destroyed unless they're absolutely certain. That afternoon, Daniel returned from questioning like a thundercloud given human form. He slammed through our front door with such force that the windows rattled. You told him I raped you. His voice was deadly quiet, more frightening than shouting. You actually went to the sheriff and accused your own son of rape? I stood my ground, though my legs felt like water. Because you did. He backhanded me across the face, the blow snapping my head sideways and filling my mouth with blood. Stars exploded behind my eyes, but I didn't fall. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed. Williams thinks you're a confused old woman looking for attention. I told him you've been acting strange since Dad died, making up stories, living in fantasies. He believes me. Because you're a good liar, I said, wiping blood from my split lip. You've had 42 years of practice. His second blow knocked me to the floor. But even as I lay there tasting blood and terror, I felt something unexpected relief. The pretense was over. No more careful words or walking on eggshells. We both knew what this was now war. Here's what's going to happen, Daniel said, standing over me like a conquering general. You're going to Williams tomorrow and tell him you were confused, that it never happened. You're going to sign over your half of this property to me. And you're going to learn to keep your mouth shut, or I'll make sure everyone in Willow Creek knows exactly how crazy you've become. I struggled to my feet, ignoring the pain shooting through my ribs. And if I refuse, his smile was winter cold. Then I'll kill you and tell everyone you fell down the stairs. Tragic accident. Elderly woman distraught over false accusations against her loving son loses her footing and breaks her neck. I'll be devastated, of course. The grieving son who lost his mother just as we were reconciling. The casual way he described my murder made my blood freeze. This wasn't the angry threat of a drunk man. This was a calculated plan from someone who'd thought through every detail. But Daniel had made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. 40 years of nursing had taught me to assess situations quickly, to remain calm under pressure, and to think strategically about life and death decisions. While he saw a frightened old woman, I was actually gathering intelligence. I need time to think, I said, playing the role he expected. You have until morning, he said. Choose wisely. That night, real rain began, not the gentle shower we'd been having, but the kind of biblical deluge that turns creeks into rivers and rivers into destroyers. The Mississippi was already swollen from weeks of October precipitation, and weather reports warned of potential flooding. I lay in bed, listening to the water drum against our roof, planning my escape. Daniel had settled into his usual evening routine of drinking himself unconscious, but I couldn't count on that lasting. If I was going to act, it had to be soon. At 2 a.m., I crept downstairs and called Martha from the kitchen phone, keeping my voice to a whisper. Martha, it's Evelyn. I need help. Jesus, it's the middle of the night. What's wrong? I told her about Daniel's ultimatum, his plan to kill me if I didn't cooperate. Martha listened in growing horror. You can't stay there, she said. Come here now tonight. I can't leave in this weather. The roads are already flooding, and he'll hear the car. Then we call the state police. This is beyond Tom Williams now. Not yet, I said. I need evidence first, something that proves he's planning to hurt me. Otherwise, it's still just my word against his. Martha was quiet for a moment. What kind of evidence? He keeps surveillance photos of me in his room, plans for revenge. If I can get those to the authorities? Evelyn, that's too dangerous. If he catches you, if I don't try, I'm dead anyway, I said. At least this way I'm fighting back. We agreed on a plan. Martha would contact her nephew in Des Moines, a lawyer who specialized in criminal cases. If I could gather evidence of Daniel's premeditation, we'd have a stronger case when we went to the state authorities. But first I had to survive until morning. I waited until Daniel's snores rattled the walls before creeping back to his room. The manila folder was exactly where I'd left it, but now I photographed every page with George's old camera working by moonlight that filtered through the rain-soaked windows. The private detective's report, the surveillance photos, the unmailed letter threatening revenge. I documented everything, my hands shaking with fear and adrenaline. This evidence would prove that Daniel's assault wasn't a moment of drunken rage, but a calculated attack planned over months. I was photographing the last page when a floorboard creaked behind me. Find anything interesting? Daniel stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hall light, like an avenging angel. He was drunk, but not unconscious, and his voice carried the lazy menace of a predator playing with wounded prey. I was looking for aspirin. I lied, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. In my private papers. How thoughtful of you, Mother. I backed toward the window, clutching the camera to my chest. Daniel, please. Please. What please? Don't hurt the woman who's been spying on me. Please forgive the thief who's stealing evidence from my room. He was moving closer, and I could smell the bourbon on his breath, see the violence building in his eyes. You surveilled me first. I said, desperation making me bold. Watched me plan to hurt me, wrote letters about destroying my life. I'm just defending myself. You're just proving how crazy you are, he said, lunging forward. I dodged to the side, surprising us both with my agility. The camera flew from my hands, crashing against the wall and scattering film across the floor. Daniel roared with rage and grabbed for me, but I was already moving, driven by pure survival instinct. The chase that followed lasted only minutes, but felt like hours. Through the house, we ran, Daniel cursing and stumbling in his drunken fury, while I stayed barely ahead of his reaching hands. Rain hammered the windows like bullets, and the lights flickered as power lines swayed in the wind. I made it to the kitchen before he caught me, his hand closing around my wrist like a vice. He spun me around his face, twisted with rage and something that might have been disappointment. You stupid bitch, he panted. You couldn't just take your punishment quietly, could you? Had to go digging, had to fight back, had to make this harder than it needed to be. Let me go, I said, though we both knew he wouldn't. Oh, I'm letting you go, all right. Permanently. He reached for the kitchen knife block, and I knew with crystal clarity that I was about to die. Daniel had moved beyond threats and intimidation to actual murder, and there was no one coming to save me. But sometimes salvation comes from unexpected directions. As Daniel's hand closed around the largest knife, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, and the lights went out completely. In the sudden darkness, his grip loosened just enough for me to break free. I ran into the howling night rain, immediately soaking through my nightgown as I splashed through puddles that had been our front yard that afternoon. Behind me, I could hear Daniel crashing around in the dark house, shouting curses that mixed with the thunder. The walk to Martha's house was the longest mile of my life. By the time I reached her door, I was hypothermic and barely conscious, but I was alive, and I was finally ready to stop running. It was time to fight back with everything I had. Martha wrapped me in blankets and hot coffee while I sobbed out the night's terror. By dawn, she'd made 3 phone calls that would change everything. One to her nephew David Ellis, the criminal lawyer in Des Moines. one to Dr. Susan Phillips, who specialized in assault cases, and one to Detective Ray Morrison from the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation. No more small-town politics, Martha declared, her jaw set with determination. This needs professional investigators who aren't afraid of family scandals. Morrison arrived that afternoon, a hard-eyed man in his 40s, who'd seen enough evil to believe any story, no matter how shocking. He listened without interruption as I recounted everything: the assault, Daniel's discovery of his adoption, the threats and surveillance, the attempted murder. "Mrs. Harper," he said when I finished, "I want you to know that I believe you completely. I've seen cases like this before: family members who use blood relations as cover for abuse. The fact that he's adopted doesn't make this any less serious." For the first time since the assault, I felt truly heard. Morrison arranged for Dr. Phillips to examine me, documenting injuries that would hold up in court. More importantly, he sent investigators to search Daniel's room while he was at work. They found everything: the surveillance photos, the revenge letter, even a detailed floor plan of our house with my bedroom marked in red ink. Daniel had been planning something far beyond the assault I'd already endured. "He was escalating," Morrison explained as we reviewed the evidence. "The rape was just the beginning. These plans suggest he intended to kill you and make it look accidental." The arrest happened on October 22nd, exactly 1 week after the assault. I watched from Martha's kitchen window as Morrison and 2 state troopers pulled up to our flood-damaged farmhouse. Daniel was hungover and unprepared when they knocked, still believing he'd covered his tracks perfectly. But the charges they read made his face go white: rape in the first-degree assault, and battery, criminal threatening, and attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming: his own photographs and letters condemning him more thoroughly than any witness testimony could. The reaction in Willow Creek was explosive. Word spread through our small town like wildfire, and suddenly, I was the center of a scandal that had people choosing sides. Some supported me, other women who'd suffered in silence, friends who'd always suspected Daniel wasn't quite right. But many others turned against me, believing I'd betrayed the sacred bond of motherhood by sending my own son to prison. The cruelest betrayal came from Reverend Thomas, who visited Martha's house to lecture me about Christian forgiveness and family reconciliation. "Evelyn," he said in his most patronizing tone, "I've known Daniel since he was a boy. Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive whatever misunderstanding occurred between you." "Reverend," I replied, my voice steady as stone, "there's no misunderstanding rape. When a man forces himself on a woman against her will, that's exactly what it is, regardless of their relationship. If your God demands I forgive that without seeking justice, then perhaps I need to find a different God." He left shaking his head, and I knew he'd be spreading word about my spiritual crisis at Sunday service. But I'd rather face judgment from hypocrites than live in terror from a predator who happened to share my name. The revelation that would reshape everything came 3 days before the trial, during what should have been routine preparation. David Ellis, Martha's nephew and my criminal attorney, was reviewing Daniel's psychiatric evaluation when he noticed something odd in the family history section. Evelyn," he said, frowning at the paperwork, "there's a discrepancy here." Daniel told the psychiatrist that he discovered his adoption through a private detective 6 months ago, but the detective's report is dated differently. He showed me the document, and my blood turned to ice. The investigation hadn't begun 6 months ago. It had started 2 years earlier, shortly after Daniel moved back home following his divorce. "This changes everything," Ellis said. "He didn't assault you in a moment of rage after learning the truth. He's known about his parentage for 2 years, living in your house planning his revenge. This wasn't crime of passion, it was calculated long-term torture." But there was more. Ellis had requested Daniel's complete file from the private detective, and what we found painted a picture of obsession that went far beyond simple revenge. Daniel hadn't just investigated his adoption, he'd researched every aspect of my life: bank records, medical history, employment records, even interviews with former patients and colleagues. He'd been building a comprehensive profile of the woman he blamed for stealing his real life. More disturbing were the psychological evaluations the detective had recommended. Daniel had been seeing a psychiatrist in Des Moines, Dr. Richard Steinberg, who'd diagnosed him with what he called severe narcissistic rage and fantasies of retribution. The doctor's notes were chilling. Patient demonstrates classic signs of narcissistic collapse following discovery of adoption. Blames adoptive mother for identity theft and expresses elaborate fantasies of punishment and revenge. Particular focus on sexual domination as means of asserting power over perceived oppressor. High risk for escalating violence if fantasies remain unchecked. Ellis looked up from the file, his face grim. Evelyn, this psychiatrist, warned that Daniel was dangerous 2 years ago. He recommended immediate intervention, possibly hospitalization. Then why didn't anything happen? Because Daniel was a voluntary patient. He could stop treatment anytime he wanted, and apparently he did right after the doctor filed this report. The implications were staggering. Daniel hadn't just discovered his adoption and lashed out in anger. He'd known the truth for 2 years, sought psychiatric help that confirmed his dangerous mental state, then deliberately discontinued treatment so he could act on his violent impulses. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the deepest part of Daniel's investigation file was correspondence with Margaret Sullivan's surviving family in Chicago. Her sister Catherine was still alive at 93, living in a nursing home on the South Side. Daniel had been writing to her for 18 months, claiming to be Margaret's son, seeking information about his real family. Catherine's letters painted a very different picture of Margaret than the idealized version Daniel had constructed. She'd been troubled, impulsive, involved with married men, despite her Catholic upbringing. Her pregnancy with Daniel had been the final scandal that drove her from the family home. But the most devastating revelation was in Catherine's final letter, dated just 3 months earlier. Dear Daniel, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I've been carrying a lie for 43 years, and I'm too old to keep secrets anymore. Margaret wasn't your mother. She was covering for our younger sister Rose, who was only 15 when she got pregnant. The family was so ashamed they sent Rose away and let Margaret claim the baby as her own. Margaret never had children. She died in a tuberculosis sanatorium in 1920, 7 years after you were born. I don't know who your real parents were, but it wasn't Margaret Sullivan. I'm sorry for the deception, but Rose made us promise to never tell. She's been dead for 20 years now, so I guess it doesn't matter anymore. Ellis and I stared at each other in stunned silence. Daniel's entire revenge fantasy was built on yet another lie. Margaret Sullivan wasn't his mother any more than I wasn't. He'd destroyed our family, assaulted me, and planned murder based on a complete fiction. We have to tell him, I said finally. Before the trial starts, he has to know the truth. Ellis shook his head. Evelyn, this information doesn't help his case. It makes him look even more delusional. His lawyer won't want to introduce evidence that his client's motive was based on complete fantasy. I don't care about legal strategy, I said. That boy has been tormented by lies his entire life. He deserves to know the truth, even if he's too far gone to accept it. What I didn't say was that I still loved him despite everything he'd done. The mother in me wanted to ease his pain, even as the victim in me demanded justice for his crimes. But when Ellis approached Daniel's attorney with the new information, the response was explosive. Daniel flew into a rage that required sedatives and restraints, screaming that we were fabricating evidence to make him look insane. It's all lies, he shouted as they dragged him from the meeting room. Margaret was my real mother. She would have loved me. This is just another trick to steal my identity. Even faced with documentary proof, Daniel couldn't accept that his entire motivation had been based on fantasy. The truth was too devastating to his constructed reality. So he simply rejected it, clinging to his delusions, even as they destroyed him. And in that moment, I finally understood the full tragedy of what had happened to us. Daniel wasn't just a criminal who'd chosen evil over good. He was a broken man who'd been so damaged by lies and secrets that he could no longer distinguish truth from fiction. The assault on me was terrible, but it was also the desperate act of someone drowning in his own delusions. That didn't excuse his crimes or lessen my need for justice, but it helped me understand that the boy I'd raised and the monster who'd attacked me were both victims of the same tragic web of deception that had poisoned our family for decades. The question now was whether a jury would see Daniel as a calculating criminal or a mentally ill man who needed treatment rather than punishment. Either way, I was determined to see justice done not just for myself, but for the truth that had been buried under too many years of well-intentioned lies. The trial began on January 15, 1956, in a courthouse packed with reporters and curiosity seekers who turned our family tragedy into statewide entertainment. Judge Harrison, a stern man with kind eyes, imposed strict rules about courtroom behavior, making it clear that this was a search for truth, not a spectacle. I sat between David Ellis and Detective Morrison, wearing my best navy dress and the pearl necklace George had given me for our anniversary. Across the aisle, Daniel sat with his court-appointed attorney Thomas Crawford, a sharp-eyed man from Chicago, who specialized in defending the indefensible. The jury was a mix of farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives, 12 people who would decide whether a son could rape his mother and escape justice through claims of mental illness and family dysfunction. District Attorney Mitchell's opening statement was precise and devastating. He outlined Daniel's 2-year campaign of surveillance and planning the brutal assault and the attempted murder when I tried to gather evidence. Most importantly, he addressed the adoption issue head-on. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell said, the defense will try to convince you that this case is about family secrets and identity confusion. But at its core, this is about a man who chose violence over healing revenge, over forgiveness and criminal action, over lawful resolution of his grievances. Crawford's opening was exactly what Ellis had predicted, a masterpiece of misdirection that painted Daniel as the real victim of our family's web of deception. My client is a deeply disturbed man, Crawford admitted, but his disturbance stems from a lifetime of lies told by the woman who claimed to love him. When he discovered that his entire identity was fabricated, that the woman he called mother had stolen him from his real family, he suffered a complete psychological break. The tragedy here isn't just what happened to Mrs. Harper, it's what this family's deception did to an innocent child who grew up not knowing who he really was. It was a compelling narrative that might work if the jury focused on sympathy rather than facts. But Mitchell had built a case based on evidence, not emotion. Dr. Phillips testified about my injuries with clinical precision, showing photographs that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. The bruising, torn clothing, and physical trauma were undeniable proof of violent assault regardless of the family relationship. Martha's testimony was powerful and personal. She described my condition when I fled to her house, the terror in my voice, the physical evidence of near murder. Evelyn Harper is the strongest woman I've ever known, Martha said, looking directly at the jury. For her to be that frightened, that desperate, something truly terrible must have happened. But the most devastating testimony came from Detective Morrison, who walked the jury through Daniel's elaborate planning process. The surveillance photos, the revenge letter, the psychiatric evaluation that warned of his dangerous mental state, all of it painted a picture of calculated malice, not temporary insanity. When I took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. I'd been dreading this moment for months, but facing the jury directly, I felt a strange calm descend over me. I raised Daniel from infancy. I began my voice steady. I loved him as my own child, sacrificed for him, defended him when others criticized his behavior. When he assaulted me, he didn't just commit a crime against my body. He destroyed 43 years of love and trust. I told them about the photograph that started everything about Daniel's revelation, that he'd known the truth for 2 years while living in my house and planning his revenge. I described the assault itself in clinical terms, refusing to let shame silence me. Crawford's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective. He tried to portray me as vindictive, confused, or mentally unstable, but I met each attack with calm professionalism. When he suggested I was lying about the assault, I simply asked why I would destroy my own reputation and family for false accusations. The moment that turned the jury came when Crawford made the mistake of introducing the psychiatric evidence that showed Daniel's victimization by family lies. "Mrs. Harper," he said with theatrical concern, "don't you think your deception about Daniel's parentage contributed to his mental breakdown?" "Mr. Crawford," I replied, "we made mistakes in how we handled Daniel's adoption. We thought we were protecting him from painful truths, but millions of adopted children grow up healthy and happy without assaulting their parents. Mental illness doesn't excuse criminal behavior, it explains it." I paused, looking directly at Daniel for the first time since his arrest. "I accept responsibility for the lies we told, but I won't accept responsibility for his choice to respond with violence. That decision was his alone." The defense case crumbled when Crawford tried to introduce evidence about Margaret Sullivan being Daniel's real mother. Ellis immediately objected and requested a sidebar where he revealed Catherine Sullivan's letter proving that Margaret hadn't been Daniel's mother either. Judge Harrison was stunned. "Are you telling me that the defendant's entire motive was based on false information?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Ellis replied. The woman he believed was his biological mother was actually covering for her teenage sister. Daniel's revenge fantasy was built on a complete fiction. The judge ruled that the jury needed to hear this information despite Crawford's strenuous objections. When Catherine's letter was read aloud, several jurors looked shocked, and one elderly woman shook her head sadly. Daniel's reaction was explosive. He began shouting that we were all lying, that everyone was conspiring against him, that Margaret Sullivan was his real mother and would have loved him properly. Judge Harrison had to call a recess while bailiffs restrained him. "Your Honor," Crawford said desperately when court resumed, "this clearly demonstrates my client's severe mental illness. He cannot distinguish between reality and fantasy." "Mr. Crawford," Judge Harrison replied coldly, "mental illness may explain your client's behavior, but it doesn't excuse assault, battery, and attempted murder. The jury will decide whether he's legally responsible for his actions." Daniel himself never testified. Crawford was too afraid of what he might say in his delusional state. Instead, the defense relied on psychiatric testimony about diminished capacity and family trauma. But Mitchell's closing argument brought the focus back to my rights as a victim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Daniel Harper wants you to believe that discovering family secrets justifies sexual assault and attempted murder. He wants you to excuse criminal violence because he was disappointed by his parentage. But we don't get to commit crimes just because we're unhappy with our circumstances. We don't get to hurt innocent people because we feel wronged by the world." The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Judge Harrison asked them to stand as he read their decision. "On the charge of rape in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. I felt my knees go weak with relief as Daniel's face went white with shock. "On the charge of assault and battery guilty. On the charge of attempted murder guilty. Guilty on all counts." After months of character assassination and public humiliation, 12 strangers had looked at the evidence and believed me. Justice was possible, even for elderly women accusing their own sons. The sentencing hearing brought one final surprise. Judge Harrison invited me to address the court about the impact of Daniel's crimes, something that was rare in 1956, but which he felt was necessary given the unusual circumstances. I hadn't prepared a statement, but standing at the podium facing Daniel across the courtroom, the words came naturally. "Your Honor, 43 years ago, I became a mother to a 6-month-old baby who needed love and protection. I gave him everything I had to give my time, my energy, my heart, my future. When he assaulted me, he didn't just commit a crime against my body. He destroyed every memory of love, every moment of joy, every hope I'd ever had for our family. I paused, looking directly at Daniel, who was staring at the floor. But I want to say something about forgiveness. I forgive the confused, broken man who committed these crimes. I forgive the boy who was hurt by family secrets and never learned healthy ways to deal with pain. What I cannot and will not forgive is the choice to respond to hurt with violence, to answer deception with assault, to meet disappointment with attempted murder. My voice grew stronger as I continued. Daniel Harper had many options when he learned about his adoption. He could have confronted me directly, sought counseling, built a new relationship based on truth instead of secrets. Instead, he chose to destroy everything good we'd ever shared. That choice was his alone, and he must live with the consequences. Judge Harrison's sentence was swift and severe: 25 years for rape, 10 years for assault and battery, and 5 years for attempted murder, all to be served consecutively. 40 years total, effectively a life sentence for a man who'd just turned 44. "Mr. Harper," the judge said, as Daniel stood to receive his sentence, "you have committed crimes that violate the most basic principles of family and human decency. Your actions have not only harmed your victim, they have damaged the very concept of trust between parents and children." As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one final time. For just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the confused little boy he'd once been. But then the moment passed, and he was gone, leaving me to rebuild a life he'd tried so hard to destroy. The courtroom emptied slowly, with reporters rushing to file their stories and spectators discussing the verdict in hushed tones. But I sat quietly, feeling a mixture of relief, sadness, and something that might have been peace. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would take years to fully understand. The boy I'd raised was gone forever, replaced by a man whose crimes would define the rest of his life. Yet somehow, in fighting for justice, I discovered a strength I never knew. I possessed a determination to seek truth, even when the whole world seemed determined to silence me. The trial was over, but my real journey was just beginning. The months following Daniel's conviction were both liberating and devastating. I was vindicated. The justice system had believed me. Daniel was in prison, and I was finally safe. But I'd also lost everything: my home sold to pay legal costs, my place in the community. Many people still believed I'd destroyed an innocent family, and my identity as Daniel's mother, the role that had defined me for 4 decades. The reaction in Willow Creek was exactly what I'd expected: swift, harsh, and divided. Some people, particularly women who'd suffered in silence, approached me with quiet gratitude. Sarah Henderson, whose husband had been beating her for years, finally found the courage to leave after seeing me fight back. If a 68-year-old woman can stand up to her rapist, she told me, then I can escape my abuser. But others turned against me with the righteous fury of people whose comfortable illusions had been shattered. Mrs. Jenkins, the grocer's wife, made it clear I wasn't welcome in their store. The Ladies' Auxiliary voted to indefinitely postpone my membership renewal. Even Dr. Peterson, my longtime colleague, publicly questioned my mental state, suggesting that elderly women sometimes confuse dreams with reality. The cruelest betrayal came from Reverend Thomas, who used his Sunday sermon to lecture about the tragic consequences of abandoning Christian forgiveness. Without naming me directly, he spoke about the importance of keeping family matters private and trusting in God's justice rather than man's courts. I attended that service sitting in the back pew, while he condemned my choice to seek legal justice instead of Christian reconciliation. When he finished, I stood up and walked out, and I never set foot in that church again. Martha remained my anchor through it all. She fielded hostile phone calls, accompanied me to legal appointments, and gradually helped me rebuild a social circle from the scattered remains of my old life. Her faith in me never wavered, even when my own confidence crumbled. You did the right thing," she told me during one of my darker moments. 40 years from now, women will thank you for showing them that age doesn't disqualify you from seeking justice." Her prediction proved more accurate than either of us could have imagined. Within weeks of the trial's end, letters began arriving from women across the Midwest. They'd read about my case in newspapers, heard about it on radio programs, or learned of it through word-of-mouth networks that carried stories of survival and resistance. The letters were heartbreaking in their similarity, women who'd suffered abuse from fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers, but who'd never found the courage to speak out. My victory had given them hope that their voices might also be heard. One letter from a young mother in Kansas particularly moved me. "Dear Mrs. Harper, I read about your trial in the Topeka newspaper, and I wanted you to know that you saved my life. My stepfather has been abusing me since I was 12, and when I tried to tell my mother, she called me a liar and threw me out of the house. I've been living on the streets thinking no one would ever believe me, but seeing your courage gave me hope. I went to the police yesterday and filed charges. The detective said cases like mine are hard to prove, but at least now there's a record. Thank you for showing me that women's voices matter no matter what our families say." I answered every letter personally, sharing what I'd learned about building legal cases, finding supportive doctors, and surviving the social backlash that inevitably followed such accusations. Gradually, without planning or intention, I became part of an informal network of women helping other women escape family violence. The work was emotionally draining, reliving my trauma repeatedly, dealing with skeptical authorities, facing the ongoing stigma of being that woman who sent her own son to prison. But it was also healing, giving meaning to the suffering I'd endured. I began speaking at women's groups, church gatherings, and legal conferences about the particular challenges faced by elderly victims of family violence. The audiences were often skeptical. This was 1956 after all, and public discussion of rape and incest was virtually taboo, but I pressed on, knowing that silence served only the perpetrators. Violence is violence. I would tell these audiences regardless of the relationship between victim and perpetrator. Family ties don't create immunity from criminal prosecution. Love doesn't require accepting abuse. Meanwhile, Daniel began what would become a 15-year correspondence from prison. His early letters were angry, accusatory, filled with rage at the lies that had destroyed his life. He maintained that Margaret Sullivan was his real mother, that Catherine's letter was fabricated, that everyone was conspiring to drive him insane. "You destroyed me with your lies," he wrote in one particularly bitter letter. "Everything I am, everything I became is your fault. You stole my real identity and gave me a fake life in a place I hated. Now you've stolen my freedom too. I hope you're satisfied with your revenge." I answered each letter patiently, trying to reach whatever remained of the boy I'd raised. I told him about the ongoing investigation into his parentage, about efforts to locate his actual biological parents, about the psychiatric help that was available in prison. But Daniel refused all offers of counseling or therapy. In his mind, he was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, not a criminal who needed treatment. Reality had become too painful for him to accept, so he retreated deeper into delusion. Gradually, though, his letters began to change. The rage remained, but it was increasingly mixed with confusion and something that might have been regret. Prison had sobered him in ways that freedom never could, stripping away the alcohol and isolation that had enabled his worst impulses. "I dream about the flood sometimes," he wrote in 1959. "Not the real flood, but a dream flood where I'm drowning and you're on the shore deciding whether to save me or let me die. I always wake up before I find out what you choose." By 1962, his letters had become almost philosophical, filled with references to books he was reading and questions about the nature of identity and family. "I've been thinking about what makes someone real," he wrote. "Is it blood? Is it love? Is it the stories we tell ourselves about who we are? I thought I knew the answer when I found that photograph, but now I'm not sure I know anything at all." The breakthrough came in 1965, 10 years after his conviction, when prison investigators finally located Daniel's actual biological parents. His father had been a traveling salesman named Robert Chen, who'd had a brief affair with Rose Sullivan in 1912. Rose had died in the 1918 flu pandemic, But Robert was still alive, living in California, with a family who'd never known about his illegitimate son in Chicago. When Daniel learned the truth that neither Margaret nor Rose had been in any position to give him the idealized childhood he'd fantasized about, something inside him finally broke. He spent 3 months in the prison psychiatric ward catatonic, with grief for the life he'd destroyed, chasing a fantasy that had never existed. His letter from that period was the first one to acknowledge what he'd done to me. Mom, I keep using that word even though I know I lost the right to it 10 years ago. I've been thinking about the difference between reasons and excuses. I had reasons for feeling angry about the adoption, but I had no excuse for what I did to you. You didn't deserve to pay for other people's lies. You didn't deserve to be punished for loving me when no one else would. I don't expect forgiveness because what I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that I finally understand the difference between being hurt and choosing to hurt others. It wasn't a complete apology. Daniel was still too proud and too damaged for that. But it was acknowledgement, and that was more than I'd ever expected to receive. The social changes of the 1960s brought new attention to issues of family violence and women's rights. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963, and suddenly there was language for experiences that women had never been able to name. The civil rights movement demonstrated that oppressed groups could organize for change, and some women began applying those lessons to their own struggles. I found myself increasingly in demand as a speaker and advocate. My case had become something of a landmark, cited in legal textbooks and referenced in legislative hearings about improving laws protecting abuse victims. The shy, isolated woman I'd been in 1955 was gradually replaced by someone more confident, more outspoken, more willing to challenge systems that protected perpetrators at the expense of victims. In 1968, I testified before the Iowa State Legislature about the need for better training for police officers handling family violence cases. The hearing room was packed with reporters and advocates, and my testimony made front-page news across the state. 13 years ago? I told the legislators. I was nearly murdered by my own son after reporting that he'd raped me. The local sheriff suggested I was confused, that family matters should stay private, that pursuing justice would only make things worse. That attitude nearly cost me my life, and it's still costing other women theirs. I told them about Sarah Henderson, who'd finally escaped her abusive husband, but received no support from local authorities. About Maria Santos, whose father-in-law was sexually assaulting her children, but who was told that these things happen in Mexican families. About dozens of other women whose voices had been silenced by shame, disbelief, and institutional indifference. We need laws that protect victims, not perpetrators, I concluded. We need police officers who are trained to recognize family violence as the serious crime it is. Most importantly, we need a society that believes women when they tell us they're in danger, even when the danger comes from their own families. The legislation that emerged from those hearings wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Police departments began training officers specifically to handle domestic violence cases. Shelters for abused women started receiving state funding. Most importantly, the legal system began recognizing that family relationships didn't provide immunity from criminal prosecution. Daniel died in prison in 1971, 16 years after his conviction. The cause was liver failure, the inevitable result of decades of heavy drinking that had continued even behind bars through prison-made alcohol and smuggled bottles. He was 58 years old, though he looked much older in the photograph the prison sent me. His final letter, received just weeks before his death, was the closest he ever came to a real apology. Mom, I'm dying, and I wanted to write this while I still can. I've had 16 years to think about what I did to you, and I finally understand that there are no excuses for it. You weren't perfect. No parent is, but you loved me when my real parents abandoned me. You gave me a home, a family, a chance at happiness. I threw it all away because I was angry about things that had nothing to do with you. I know I can never undo what I did. I know you can never forgive me, and you shouldn't. But I want you to know that the boy you raised is still in here, somewhere buried under all the anger, and alcohol and stupidity. That boy remembers your bedtime stories, your hugs when I was scared, your pride when I did something right. That boy loves you and always did, even when the man I became tried to destroy everything good between us. I hope when you think of me, you remember that boy sometimes. Not because I deserve it, but because he was real and he was the best part of me, and you created him with your love. I cried when I read that letter, not tears of reconciliation, because some wounds never fully heal, but tears of mourning for the relationship we might have had if Daniel had chosen healing over hatred therapy, over revenge. I attended his funeral standing alone at the graveside, while a prison chaplain said words over a man most people had forgotten. There were no other mourners. His ex-wife had remarried and moved away. His few friends from before the assault wanted nothing to do with his memory. As dirt was shoveled over his coffin, I said goodbye to the boy I'd raised and the man he'd become. I forgave him then finally, and completely, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to let go of the anger that had sustained me through the darkest years. I loved you, I whispered to the freshly turned earth. Despite everything, I loved you until the end. I lived until 1983, dying peacefully at age 96 in the small apartment in Des Moines, where I'd rebuilt my life after the trial. Martha, my faithful friend, held my hand as I passed surrounded by flowers from women whose lives had been touched by my story. The obituaries in the Des Moines Register and other newspapers were respectful, but brief, focusing on my nursing career and volunteer work, rather than the trial that had defined my later years. But the letters that poured in from across the country told a different story, hundreds of women writing to thank me for showing them that survival was possible, that justice could prevail. That age and circumstances didn't disqualify someone from demanding dignity and respect. The scholarship fund that Martha established in my honor helped dozens of young women pursue careers in law enforcement, victim advocacy, and legal aid. The Evelyn Harper Memorial Center for Family Violence Prevention, founded in Des Moines in 1985, provided counseling and legal assistance for abuse survivors. But perhaps my greatest legacy was something more intangible, the precedent that elderly women's voices mattered, that family relationships didn't provide immunity from justice, and that speaking truth to power was always worth the cost. In 1995, 40 years after my assault, a reporter from the Des Moines Register wrote a retrospective piece about my case for Women's History Month. She interviewed several prominent advocates who credited my courage with inspiring their own activism. Evelyn Harper showed us that heroism isn't always loud or dramatic, said Dr. Sandra Martinez, who founded Iowa's first rape crisis center. Sometimes it's simply the quiet determination to tell the truth, no matter how painful or unpopular that truth might be. In a world that preferred comfortable lies to difficult realities, she chose reality. In doing so, she changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless women who found courage in her example. The reporter also tracked down several women who'd corresponded with me over the years. Their stories formed a chorus of survival and resistance that stretched across decades and state lines. Mrs. Harper saved my life, said Janet Williams, a retired teacher from Nebraska. When my uncle was abusing me and no one would listen, I remembered reading about her trial. If a 68-year-old woman could find the courage to stand up to her rapist in 1956, then a 16-year-old girl could find the courage to speak up in 1958. I reported the abuse, got help, and escaped. I'm 73 now with grandchildren who'll never have to live in fear because Mrs. Harper showed me that silence isn't survival, it's surrender. The article concluded with a reflection on how much had changed since 1955. Today, we have domestic violence shelters, trained police officers, victim advocates, and laws that recognize family violence as the serious crime it is. Rape shield laws protect victims from having their sexual histories used against them in court. Marital rape is illegal in all 50 states. Children receive education about appropriate touch and how to report abuse. None of these changes happened overnight, and none happened without cost. They emerged from the courage of women like Evelyn Harper, who chose to speak truth to power, even when that power belonged to their own families. Her legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to suffer in silence, in every law that protects the vulnerable, in every voice that rises up to say, "No more." The reporter ended her piece with a quote from my final interview, given just months before my death. People sometimes ask if I regret reporting Daniel, if I wish I'd handled things differently. The answer is no. I regret that our family was built on lies. I regret that Daniel chose violence over healing. I regret that it took a crime to reveal the truth. But I don't regret seeking justice. The river near our old farm in Willow Creek flooded regularly when I was young. Every few years, the water would rise and sweep away everything in its path. Houses, crops, livestock lives. People would rebuild, but they'd rebuild in the same place, hoping the next flood wouldn't come. That's what we do with family violence. We rebuild on the same foundation of secrets and silence, hoping the next assault won't happen. But floods keep coming until you change where you build. Justice keeps failing until you change how you seek it. I couldn't stop the flood that nearly destroyed my life, but I could choose where to rebuild afterward. I chose truth over lies, justice over silence, courage over fear. That choice saved not just me, but dozens of other women who found their voices because I'd found mine. The river keeps flowing, but it doesn't have to carry our secrets anymore. It can carry our stories instead, stories of survival, of resistance of women who refuse to drown quietly in other people's lies. In the end, that was Daniel's greatest failure and my greatest triumph. He'd tried to break me with violence and intimidation, but instead, he'd revealed reserves of strength I never knew I possessed. The assault had lasted minutes. The recovery had taken years. But the woman I became in the aftermath, the advocate, the survivor, the voice for the voiceless, that woman lived for decades and touched countless lives. Water had always been part of my story, from the Mississippi that shaped my childhood to the flood that nearly destroyed my home. But I learned that water doesn't just erode and devastate, it also cleanses, nourishes, and creates new channels where none existed before. The flood of 1955 had washed away my old life, but in its wake, I'd built something better, a legacy of courage that would outlive both Daniel's crimes and my own mortality. The photograph of Margaret Sullivan that started everything still sits in a box of legal documents in the basement of the Iowa State Historical Society evidence, in a case that helped change how America thinks about family violence. Sometimes I wonder what Margaret would think of the role her image played in our tragedy, whether she'd forgive us for the lies we told in her name. But mostly, I think about the women who write to tell me how my story changed their lives. They are my real legacy, not the legal precedents or the legislative changes, but the individual voices that rose up because mine had risen first. The river keeps flowing, and their voices flow with it, carrying stories of survival toward shores I never could have imagined. In that way, the love I'd tried to give Daniel, imperfect, complicated, built on lies, was transformed into something pure and powerful and true. That transformation, perhaps, was the greatest justice of all.